While reading the works of George Louis Borghes and Pablo Neruda, it's probably not uncommon to have to look up once in a while and just loudly exclaim,
"What the heck did I just read?" I mean, Borghes more like Borghes, am I right? Wrong. Because while both authors can be, little dense at times, they are concocting really interesting stories that challenge what it actually means to read a story. What really is a work of fiction, and do words actually have to make sense when put together? And does it matter that I can't read Spanish? Because I only took 2 years of that in high school, and I want to be just as privy as the next guy to the true meaning of life. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's start with Neruda, because he's just slightly easier to understand. The Heights of Machu Picchu is first and foremost a spiritual quest, either for the narrator himself or for humanity in general. It's almost quite literally an ascension up a mountain, like Moses, Jesus, or insert other Bible figure here. There's quite a few to choose from. And it's like the reverse of Dante's descent down into the Inferno, or, like when he climbs up a mountain to get through Purgatory in the next poem. No one reads that one. Anyway, the story of the poem is a man who struggled with depression and feeling lost in a crowded city, slowly climbing up the ancient structure of Machu Picchu. As he climbs, he begins to appreciate the wonder of the citadel and the monumentous power of those who built it. It's about the beauty of America, the strength of the weak, the true nature of the enduring human spirit. But with such a simple premise, why is it so hard to understand? Well, because Neruda apparently doesn't like to use words in their conventional roles, and he revels in their absurdity by mashing them together to create new meanings. Not to mention it's poetry, so the standards for traditional sentence structure are quite a bit looser. But what is the effect that Neruda's creative use of language has on the reader and his story? Well, I don't quite remember who brought it up in class the other day, but they were sitting right over there. So if you could kindly raise your hand, please. Great, thank you. Hopefully I've now cited my source. Anyway, what they said is that Neruda uses words to convey emotion rather than strict logical meaning. It's the feeling of weight like stones tied to the life of wellsprings, or our gut reaction to blood, or the feeling of salty mist on your face. Neruda's storytelling has less to do with describing the actual hike up a mountain than the deep spiritual transformation he's trying to convey. And because I should probably add something of my own to this conversation, he also heavily uses the use of symbols for this idea. For instance, what in the world is a cosmic eagle? Well, it's certainly nothing Neruda can point to, but this single, almost nonsensical image is perhaps the perfect symbol for the Heights of Machu Picchu as a whole. If you break it down emotionally, the cosmic part could refer to the grandiose nature of the narrative. It represents destiny and wonder. But the eagle part is much more involved as a symbol. Like the condor, another large bird of prey Neruda often references, it could represent the spirit of the Andes. It's native wildlife that's free and flowing and iconic of the people it represents. It's as much part of Machu Picchu as the steps themselves. And with this concept of symbols in mind, one way to read Neruda is to recognize that oftentimes the words he doesn't include are just as important as the ones he uses to represent them. As the narrator repeats the word death, he's really describing the soul-crushing despair he feels wandering around the city. Like a net that can't catch anything, or a jumbled deck of cards. When he mentions the seasons of winter and autumn, he's alluding to these times of death and loss. What really matters while reading The Heights of Machu Picchu is the depth of Neruda's connotation as he uses these repeated symbols. As readers, he wants us to be responsible for asking the questions: why are the stones bloody? How can time be subterranean? And what does it mean to cut the eyelashes of a flower? Maybe some of the original context was lost in translation, but as individual readers, we are also responsible for interpreting our own meaning from Neruda's unusual juxtapositions. It all comes back to what duties does a reader have to the author? What exactly is the depth of that relationship? Which brings us to Borghes, and whether or not the author matters at all. If one of the central questions of Neruda is how can I tell a story, then Borghes is constantly asking, why should we trust a story? In a work he explicitly labels as fiction, the main theme throughout the book is interpreting reality. And to Borghes, reality can be represented by books and stories. Even his very first story is about the obviously fictional society of Talon, and yet he treats its encyclopedia as bona fide fact. It even appears in another story as just another book in the Library of Babel. And to blur the lines between fiction and fact even further, pretty deep into the novel, Borghes confirms the fact that he's been a character in his own work the entire time. In the form of a sword, a character speaks directly to the narrator and says, "Borghes, I have confessed this to you, a stranger." So what on earth is going on here, and what is Borghes trying to tell us by constantly lying? Well, he actually managed to write in a guide on how to read this book right into the text. It comes in one of the most forgettable stories in part 1, called An Examination of the Work of Herbert Quain. I mean, come on, this one doesn't even have a plot. Anyway, the story is about the organization of an author and how to read his work. And if you, I don't know, just assume that Herbert Quain is a stand-in for Borghes, then we can take his advice. I mean, even the number of stories in this diagram matches the distribution in part 1 of Ficciones, if you don't count the prologue. And if you don't, it matches part 2. So, he writes that two narratives, X7 and X8, lack individual worth. Mere juxtaposition lends them effectiveness. In other words, his stories are connected, and more meaning can be gleaned when interpreted off of each other. Which brings us to the linchpin of the entire book, the Garden of Forking Paths. And here's where we might need a few tinfoil hats. Because the Garden of Forking Paths is Borges' idea of reality. It's a labyrinth of every possible combination of events, all existing in one connected space. Which is eerily similar to an earlier story called The Library of Babel, which is an infinite labyrinth of books containing all possible combinations of letters existing in one connected space. Books are Borges' representation of paths throughout the entire novel. And each one is a product of randomness. Like, I don't know, wherever you land is kind of like a lottery? And that's why he argues it actually doesn't matter who wrote Don Quixote. Sure, maybe it was Cervantes or Pierre Menard, but it's also just a random combination of letters. It's just another path, no different than the Book of Talon or 1001 Nights. So after he constructed this complicated structure called the Garden or the Library in part 1, Borges goes on to populate it in part 2, which he aptly calls Artifices, which I had to look up. And guess what? It means trickery and lies. Borges had some serious trust issues. So every story from here on out involves someone tricking someone else. From a Shyamalan-esque twist in a complicated murder plot to the ultimate archetypal example of betrayal in Judas. Way back in Herbert Quain, Borges compares novels to games and argues that they must follow the essential features of all games: symmetry, arbitrary rules, and tedium. Navigating the garden, or the labyrinth of Borges' construction, is playing a game, with everyone else constantly trying to trick or outsmart you. But remember, the great maze of reality is also a series of books. And all of this is coming from a book of Borges' own construction. I believe there is no better way to describe trying to understand Ficciones than finding symmetry, discovering his arbitrary rules, and doing it over and over again. So, should we trust authors? Can we trust Borges or even Neruda when they both just don't make sense? Do they have the authority to tell us that something seemingly meaningless implies a deeper understanding that we have to go find? I would say yes, because like Menard's Don Quixote, everyone has a different interpretation of the text. You bring more context to the Heights of Machu Picchu. Even the fact it's in English is new and different and meaningful, even if the author doesn't know what's gonna happen. We are all interpreting the work into something we can understand, and therefore there are literally infinite possibilities for meaning. And reality? Or maybe not. Maybe there is no greater truth in these works. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all just fiction.